In Unit 1, Part 3, we'll continue to define important terms and spend our time now talking about language. Part 3 corresponds to slides 35 to 55. In Part 2, we talked about communication and speech. And in Part 3, we continue to pull apart and describe speech versus language versus communication. Part 3's focus is to define and describe language. As mentioned and described on page 7 of our book under Speech and Language Rejoined, just wanted to remind you that speech, language, and communication are not isolated. During our typical conversations, as we communicate our messages, we're using speech and language. When we're in the speaker's role or the writer's role, we're using expressive language. And when we're in the listener's role or the reader's role, we're using our receptive language. In this course, we study the development of speech, the development of language, and the development of communication. We'll see that speech, language, and communication develop for the typical child effortlessly and simultaneously. We'll also see that speech, language, and communication each has its own developmental sequence. So, as an educated professional, you always want to know what's normal and typical so that you can identify when it's not. Let's now look at a definition of language by the American Speech Language Hearing Association. This is the national professional organization for speech-language pathologists and audiologists. This is a very comprehensive definition, but I really wanted to share it with you. What is language? Language is a complex and dynamic system of conventional symbols that is used in various modes or modalities for thought and communication. Modern views of human language include that language evolves within specific historical, social, and cultural contexts. Language as rule-governed behavior is described by at least 5 parameters: phonologic, morphologic, syntactic, semantic, and pragmatic. Language learning and use are determined by the interaction of biological, cognitive, psychosocial, and environmental factors. An effective use of language for communication requires a broad understanding of human interaction, including such associated factors as nonverbal or non-linguistic cues, motivation, and socio-cultural roles. Here's another definition of language. It's a little shorter, slightly modified from page 5 of our book. Language is a socially shared system of abstract or arbitrary symbols and language rules, the specific conventions of which are learned. Let's now take a closer look at language as we go in and define abstract arbitrary symbols, the language rules, and what is meant by a socially shared system. So first, let's take a closer look at the arbitrary abstract symbols of language, which are the phonemes or the speech sounds and the words. So, speech sounds of a language are known as phonemes. And here's a good definition of a phoneme. The definition of phoneme is the smallest linguistic unit of sound that signals a difference or a change in meaning. And here are examples of how English phonemes can signal a change in meaning of the word. So P versus B, pat, bat, cup, cub. Or T versus D phonemes, tie versus die, or kit versus kid. So just by using different phonemes, the meaning of the word changes. So individual speech sounds or phonemes differ across languages. For example, Hebrew has a guttural ch as a meaningful sound and English does not. Speech sounds of each language are finite, but the way in which the sounds are combined into words is almost limitless. We just need to adhere to the rules of that language. So this allows languages to constantly evolve as new words are added. For example, selfie, blog, and texting. So in summary, the abstract, arbitrary symbols of language are the specific phonemes of that language and the combination of those phonemes to create words. So the word house and the word casa in Spanish and the word bait in Hebrew all represent the same thing. Now let's take a look at the language rules. Each language, be it English or Spanish, has its own set of phonemes or speech sounds and its own set of rules for combining those phonemes into words and then those words into meaningful and grammatical sentences. Language rules are the specific rules used across each language that dictate how phonemes are sequenced to form words and how words are sequenced or ordered to form meaningful and grammatical sentences. So knowledge of the finite phonemes of a language and knowledge of the language rules permits a person to use that language productively. That is, to be able to generate and to create sentences that have never been produced before. And so when we say that we're able to generate and create sentences, it also means that we're being generative and creative regarding our language use. So the rules of language. Here's a very nice table from Owen's 9th edition. And here also is the same information that I've summarized for you. But let's take a look at Owen's table here. The rules of language. There are rules for form of the language, and these are considered to be the building blocks of the language. These are rules of syntax, morphology, and phonology. We have rules of content or meaning, and these are the rules of semantics. And then we've got rules for language use within the social context, and these are our rules of pragmatics. And here again, the 5 language rules are represented under form of the language, meaning component for the language, and use component for the language. Okay, so socially shared system. Language is a conventional system that is agreed upon by the members of the language community. That is, the community has agreed on the speech sounds or the phonemes to use and the language rules to follow. Again, there's no logic as to why the sequence of phonemes in pen means pen, or paper, or book, or table, or chair mean what they do. And in English or Spanish, these same objects are known by different sequences of phonemes. But remember, these phonemes are arbitrary, but meaningful because the language community has agreed upon them. So let's summarize what we've learned so far about language. All languages are complex symbol systems of phonemes and words, and languages use symbols to represent objects, events, concepts, and relationships. Because of the symbolic nature of language, we can talk about dinosaurs, outer space, the ocean floor, without having any direct experience with any of these places or concepts. We know what these words represent or mean because we know the symbols of the language and we know its rules. So we're now at the end of Unit 1, Part 3. You should be able to answer the following learning objectives for Part 3. You should be able to explain the relationship between speech, language, and communication, define language, describe the arbitrary, abstract symbols of a language, describe the 5 language rules, and explain how language is a socially shared system.